listeners to Mosaic's Life in Canada's podcast. This is our third podcast interviewing Professor Sir Jonathan Asbridge and Professor Andrew Miles, who are the two senior officers and founders of the European Society for Person-Centered Healthcare in the UK. They are here to continue our panel discussion on person-centered care in all its many dimensions and to refer to their latest article, Person-Centered Care 2025, It's High Time That We Nudge the Rhetoric into Reality, which is featured in the September to December 2025 Mosaic's newsletter. During their discussion on this podcast, they will be referring to their several important points and conclusions within their article, Person-Centered Care. This article can be found on our website under mosaichomecare.com under the blog section. Professor Sir Jonathan Asbridge and Professor Andrew Miles, it's so nice to feature you both on our podcast today and calling in from the UK across the pond. Thank you for joining. It's nice to see you.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here.
So I'm going to start, I think, with Professor Miles. I just wanted to find out, what was your first experience in person-centered care that led you to where you are now? And Professor Asbridge, you can also comment as well if you have anything to update.
I think my case and Jonathan's example will be different. I think that's probably fair to say. In my own case, I mean, my early training was in medicine and biomedicine, so very much disease orientated, biochemistry, physiology, toxicology, anatomy, very body as individual as machine, if you like. And then I decided that I would go into public health medicine, public health science, which I did. And then I think probably after a few years, 5-6 years, and then working very closely during that time in public health with clinicians in many of the London teaching hospitals, including Bart's and King's and so on, and St. Thomas's. Then I began to see that public health was, by its nature, impersonal, dealing with populations, subpopulations, talking about incidence and prevalence of disease, talking about morbidity in terms of the machine of the body, talking about mortality, and so on. And I began, and having trained in Catholic theology alongside, over the years, alongside medicine, biomedicine, with its absolute focus on the human person and the dignity and richness of the human person, I began to see that the public health really wasn't for me. I mean, it has its uses, sure, but it doesn't say anything, really, very little, if anything, about the effects of disease in the life of the human person. And that is when I began to study the work of the North Americans, in fact, particularly in the States, who are talking about patient-centered medicine. And I thought, no, okay, patient, fine, medicine, okay. So let's have a closer look at this. And then, of course, they began then talking about relationship-based medicine. I know we're going to go on to talk about some of the. And
that's the new term that they're using now, actually, in Ontario, the relationship-based care.
Exactly, and I mean, there's a lot we can say about, preferential emphases on particular things as opposed to throwing it all together and looking at the whole. I'm sure we'll go on to that. And then I thought, well, okay, patient is is a statistical unit, is a person is an individual with a medical record number in the clinic. Let's look at person, and then people began talking about person-centered medicine. Medicine is medicine. It looks at particular things. Healthcare. You need healthcare to deal with the person as a whole, not just medicine. And so then we began talking about person-centered healthcare and health and social care. And I guess that, well, I mean, in a bit of a nutshell, that was my own sort of journey from biochemical and biological pathways right through to looking individual people who suffer in the eyes, so to speak.
Thank you for that. And Jonathan, do you have anything to add on that, on how you got started into person-centered care?
Well, it was very interesting. I actually trained as a nurse at St Thomas's in the 1970s, 77, I think. And nursing in this country was sort of lagging behind a lot of the theory that was being generated from the United States. And I was able to, I won a scholarship actually as a student to go to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And we had a program there called Patient-Centered Care. And that really combined with the fact that in the UK at that time, we were introducing something called the nursing process, which was all about individual patients, in effect, being individually assessed, individually have a plan of care for them, and also then evaluating interventions in a more systematic way than the way we used to, when nursing in those days was very based on an industrial model of tasks rather than a holistic assessment of the patient. And always, as nurses, we always have been the ones who the difference between nursing and medicine is that medicine focuses on pathology and nursing focuses on the effects of the pathology on the patient. So we always had our clinical nursing diagnoses was not the myocardial infarction. It was the fact the patient had pain and the patient was breathless, the patient was unable to mobilize, those sort of things, in order for us to produce a plan of care. But then over time, and certainly in doing the collaborative work with Andrew and others, you start learning that it's and as individual human beings, it all comes down to the fact that we're all people. We all have our values, we all have our preferences, we all have our our beliefs, and therefore that is on top of the pathology we may be suffering from, the physiological challenges we may be dealing with. So, and then when I moved more into leadership and management, when I was designing health services, I went to the New England Medical Center in Boston and was looking at some of the care management there, the case management roles, and where you started building pathways for patients. Then you suddenly start saying, well, if you build the services and the clinical resources around the individual needs of that patient, not just their physical, but their psychological, their social needs, then normally what you find is that you give the support they need, and with that support, often they can do with less. So it became something which, if you focus on, you can then find that you actually can make a little go a long way, because you're getting it right first time with the patient, rather than wasting resources trying to do things that are not going to work. So that was really me. That's the journey. I hope it makes sense.
No, it does make sense, and it's clear, I think, for individuals who will be listening to this conversation, how important person-centered care is, and I guess coming from you and Professor Andrew Miles, how you both got started in this as well. So how can you get people in the healthcare industry to experience that first step, you think? And we know that everybody's first step will be different depending on a number of factors, I guess, within their organization, or how they're implementing person-centered care, or people-centered care, or emotional-centered care, or family-centered care. I mean, there's so many terminologies used, I guess, under person-centered care. So if one of you wanted to,
it's a bit like the Holy Rosary. There's a bead for everything. You just give them emotional, psychological, narrative, preferences. I'll just jump in quickly,
yes,
and I would say that in terms of the industries, whether it's healthcare industry or pharma or whatever, or technology industry, I think they will be hearing the political rhetoric. We must increase patient satisfaction. We must decrease litigation. We must blah, blah, blah. We must be more person-centered. So I think they began hearing the sort of political rhetoric, the political imperatives, to which they know they must respond from a business and organizational point of view. And then, of course, the question is, well, okay, then how do we do it? And I think it's true to say, certainly throughout healthcare, but certainly in medicine, the doctors in particular, are highly focused. They want to see. They're extremely busy. They're so used to initiative fatigue in health services. We must do this, we must do that, we must try this, we must try that, that they rightly receive any new initiative with immediate sort of skepticism, if not cynicism. And I think the only way to bring those people, these particular colleagues and wider colleagues in health services on board is to show them evidence. You can talk to them about the philosophy of the nature of the human person, the importance of dealing with, with the emotional, psychological, and so on, so state. They understand all that. They take it as a given. Their question is, how do we do it? And should we do it? And where's the evidence for all of this anyway? And I think really, until recently, relatively recently, we've had the majority of evidence has been qualitative in its nature, a vast amount of it generated by nursing, qualitative research, nursing and the allied professions, nursing in absolutely in particular. Generally, medics are concerned with empirical, quantitative hard data, and it's only relatively recently that we were beginning to see the generation of that data with quantitative data, empirical data, hard data, which show clear outcomes, not only clinical outcomes, but also in terms of cost. So they've had the rhetoric, they wondered how to respond to it because they know they must, and they're asking for evidence. We've so far fed them what evidence we've had, which is qualitative in its nature, and now we're able to feed, as so to speak. Now we're able to give them the quantitative, the hard data, and there's a journey to go there because those studies are ongoing. And a lot of people are still unconvinced. And that, I think, and I know we're going to go on to talk about that, that I think is underpinning the reluctance to invest the highly precious commodity of time, and emotional investment.
And staffing. And
of course, where do the staff come from? Where do the IT systems come from to collect the data, to analyze it, et cetera. And so that's just just to jump in there. And I think we'll probably go on to talk about the practical implications of that.
Yes, and I think Jonathan might. I think we'll touch on the patient first. Maybe the primary care teams, sort of more of a clear understanding of PCC, and teaching PCC in medical schools. I do know, this is the issue, I think, in Ontario, Canada, and it's been also noted as well that in our personal support worker schools here in Canada, is they're not teaching properly on person-centered care. They may touch on it. Oh, you have to be person-centered, and maybe give some examples or whatever. But that is a huge issue. And I mean, when we're training our staff, I mean, it's taken a long time to do that, and learning from the both of you on what we should be doing as well. We take a lot of time in training our staff and reinforcing that within companies as well, that there needs to be a champion, somebody who has done research, somebody has an understanding of that, and then training it down from top of management right down to the other staff members in an organization. So Jonathan, would you like to touch on maybe some of those points?
I could just bat in very quickly and say that picking up your point on teaching in medical schools, it's in this country certainly it's all medical schools will now teach, and have been teaching for certainly 10 years or more, communication skills. Looking the patient in the eye, and concentrating on the patient in front of you, and not looking at the screen, and so on. We want to see. There's the real patient, not the EE patient, as it were. And now in this country, certainly, shared the theory and techniques of shared decision making
Yes.
are being taught, because they have to be, because we have a major court case in this country relating to the nature of consent
Yes.
in selecting and agreeing therapies and so on. It's called the Montgomery case. Gosh, it's going back now, what, 8, 9, even 10 years, and that mandated as a legal necessity, interacting with patients, sharing knowledge, explaining,
Yes.
selecting options together, not giving, this is what we need to do, go away and do this, or this is what we will do, but actually engaging the patient in that. Because unless you do that, you don't really have proper consent.
Yes.
And that's obviously a big ethical issue. So yeah, communication skills, shared decision making, probably a bit of narrative. What are patient stories? What diagnostic and prognostic cues can we draw from narrative? And I think in this country, that's more or less it. So in a sense, it's like, well, this is the minimum we've got to do. Certainly legally. So hang on, we can only do so much. So let's just concentrate on that. So there's actually a great big black hole in real terms in terms of what is of the 80%, 85% of what should be taught that is not being taught.
Right. No, good point. And, luckily, the doctors that I have to deal with through two of the hospitals, North York General and Sunnybrook, I must say that the health professionals there and the surgeons and doctors now are giving you more choices. Well, you can do this and this is going to happen, or we can do this. So really putting it back onto the patient in making an informed decision with the information from the doctors as well. So Jonathan, did you want to touch on some of the other points? And I think as well, maybe talk a little bit too about the NHS, the long-term strategic plan, I guess, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I think the truth is, when you start listening to what patients have to say, you start realizing that there's an awful lot that can be done to improve services. And that happens in small ways in the NHS, for example. Now, I think there's been a big push to try and involve patients. However, I don't think that comes down to the local clinical team level, and therefore the actual the actual richness of feedback you can get from patients, and then collating that sometimes doesn't rise above a local team. And then if you are going to look at things like a new service from a sort of corporate perspective, quite often professional patients are brought in, and then that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the actual population case mix within the locality. But I want to give some examples of where there have been some significant improvements, which then, once you start seeing results, then that catches the eye of the CFOs, and it starts helping to promote services. I'll give you two examples. One is in pharma. We do a lot of work with pharma, and they increasingly are realizing that by talking to patients, whether they're patients with rare diseases for whom they're designing new therapies, or whether they're just general patients, that actually what they're finding is, by engaging patients very early in the drug development, in the molecule development, they are finding, for example, that they are now seeing that they can reduce the length of a clinical trial, because they don't need to run it so long, because what they're looking at in the trial, the whole gamut of stuff that they need to look at within the clinical trial, they're now choosing the things that are appropriate for those individual patients. They're not just a checklist of everything for every patient. And therefore, they don't waste resources looking at things they don't need to look at. They're looking at things that are important to the patients, both from a clinical perspective, but also from a, if you like, a narrative perspective. And they're really saving money because they're getting their drugs to market quicker, which is great for patients because it means those who are waiting are not waiting quite so long. And if you've got a rare disease, for example, you know, takes years to get a diagnosis, let alone then look for a treatment. So that's person-centered. Person-centered clinical trials is something which is really, I think the pharma call it personalized medicine or personalized, but it is about the whole person. It's not just about the molecule itself, because there's more. And then the other areas, I'll give you a very practical example. When I was in Director of Emergency Care at the Department of Health, and we opened a brand new emergency department. It was actually in Oxford, where I live. And we undertook a project to talk to patients and for them to tell us their stories. So not just a tick box. You have the stories, and we first person we interviewed, it was a husband and wife, and I think the husband had been the patient. And we discovered from that, just that, apart from a number of different things, we discovered there was not one telephone in the whole department for the use of anybody other than healthcare staff. There was no way you could make a phone call.
Right.
You had to go all the way to the front of the hospital, which is like, it's a huge hospital. So we'd built an emergency department with no communication support for families. And then just finally, one thing that I'm seeing now in my practice at Sciences, which is the development of digital technology, is going to be a game changer, because we already capture information on patient-related outcomes, which we call PROMs, and of course patient-related experience measures. And you have those measures, and that starts giving you the kind of framework which Andrew referred to in getting the data, because you know, if you've got a digital app or something. But we're beginning to get some really excellent evidence back on not just the therapies that patients are taking, but also on what makes their lives better. And it is fascinating to see that actually our cancer patients who have access to our companion app, they actually feed back. They believe the care is better because they're using the app to feed back. But they're also, as when you're using an app and when you're using it for those purposes, you're actually evaluating your own position, your own care, and you're able to see your own progress. And it can be, you know, very empowering for patients, because if they go to a consultation with a physician, how are you? Well, actually, they have a look at what the data they've got in their app, and that helps the physician and it helps the patient. And particularly, I think, even in the hard cases where treatments stop working and where there may be decisions now need to be made about palliative care and even end-of-life care, what we're finding is that having some digital support helps patients make that journey and gives them something to look at, which it helps them with that dialogue with their care team. And we find that very positive. And it's interesting, we haven't changed the amount of clinical intervention we make with those patients, but they feel more cared for.
And it's also relationship building, and just, you know, example of Mosaic on the meaning of me, and within our, well, we're doing a medical assessment at the get-go, and then we've separated it out to do a more simpler document on the person. So I think it really helps our client services team in not only finding out about the medical, and again, all the check boxes that you have to do, you know, toileting, whatever, helping somebody get in and out of bed and so forth, that it really helps the personal support workers and healthcare aides when they're going into the home. They already have a little bit of information about the person. So that relationship building is already starting. And what we're trying to do, actually, my next goal, I guess, with Mosaic is to interview our personal support workers. How is person-centered care working? And, you know, it's trying to get more feedback also from the families. How do they think it's working? Is it working? Is it helping? Is it making a difference? So I think you're always, having to get feedback. Is it through surveys? Is it with picking up the phone? Is it going to talk to, the client in the home? Is it getting feedback from the personal support workers? So
that relationship-based approach, which you mentioned, it's just indispensable. I mean, trust in life is is the basis of relationships, and it's absolutely the same in healthcare. And I think that taking the relationship-based approach builds trust, and the studies have shown that the greater the level of trust, then the more likely the patient is to adhere to agreed approaches to care, and then the more likely the patient, the greater the adherence to agreed processes of care, agreed actions, and so on, means that an increase in, for example, adherence to simple and complex medication regimens, outcomes are better as a consequence. Exacerbations of disease in the community go down with better adherence as a result of the building of trust. So and then of course there are cost implications for this. Downward cost implications for this, which
yes.
which the financial people are not blind to. And I think that that relationship, starting that relationship approach and building it through trust over time. It starts from the first encounter, doesn't it?
It does.
Which hopefully will be a partnership. So you're not going to see people changing all the time. You're going to have someone who's going to say to you, well, look, we're in this together. And for chronic diseases, of course, for chronic conditions and illnesses, that we're in this together, that means 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, possibly 25.
And I think as well, it's, with our team and what we do at Mosaic, our client services really is the first one that is dealing either with the individual or the family member. So yes, I think it involves everyone, the health professionals, the client services, the personal support workers. If there's any other outside organizations or Ontario Health at Home or NHS or whatever, it's really, you're looking at the person and, providing that care and really understanding the person, and also the family included in that, I think, as well. So.
I think that's. I think that approach. We dispense with the approach that you mentioned in our peril, and I think there are many profit-hungry commercial organizations that are more concerned with the bottom line.
Yes.
And the greater the profit.
Yes, that's
and
right.
Are prepared. Here in North America, are prepared to throw out a lot of this. If they can generate more money as a result. And, quite frankly, seeing this, because it is a reality going on, seeing this is so utterly depressing. It's something that we have to fight against. And that means we have to show the superiority of the data coming out of organizations like your own, when compared to those who are taking a rush to the bottom approach.
Yes.
They will not be the same. The one there will be a superior set of outcomes, and the other approach is going to be an inferior set of outcomes, and that it is possible to show these differences in quality with many measures. And I think that patients, and particularly those paying for care, need to be looking at this very carefully before they make their decisions. That's my view.
Okay. And, I think with what Mosaic is doing in collecting information, it's really evidence informed and also anecdotal. We, as an organization, we don't have time to do that. We leave that to the professors and the researchers. But having said that, we have an actioning group here in Ontario through some of the health providers and health professionals that meet once a month, and they've been doing a lot of work in trying to get sort of that evidence-based. But Jonathan, is there anything else you needed to say about the NHS, a long-term strategic plan?
Well, I think the NHS is interestingly published its 10-year plan, which we all recognized because it was very similar to a previous 10-year plan that had been which had been published probably about 15 years ago, which was never really taken up. And I think this is about trying to as always, providing more local access to services. And I think it'll be quite interesting to see how that is mobilized, because basically it's about moving services out from hospitals into more locally available places. It ties in with a lot of the use of resources concerns that people have, and climate and energy and carbon and all that stuff. Whether or not it actually works, or I don't know, but they would do well to talk to the people who use the service to see how best these things are developed.
And that of course is typically not done, and historically has almost never ever been done.
Yeah.
And what we have in the NHS now is a what we've always had really is a major preoccupation with throughput. We're getting up to 8 million people, I think it is, on the waiting list now. And so there is a yeah, I know, and this has a tremendous human cost, And I think that it's with such an imperative on pushing people through the system as quickly as possible to get the waiting list down for political and short-termist gains. It's person-centered care then gets put on to the back burner as something that would be nice to have, but is not really fundamentally necessary at the end of the day. And I know in the notes we were discussing, we talk about there's a real danger of patient-centered care, or the person-centered approach in care being seen as a selectable option. Well, if we can do it, if we got the time, if we got the staff, if we got the money, we can select it. But if we haven't got those things, then it remains a nice to have rather than a must have. And this is a very grave danger to anybody who wants to be looking at the patient as a person, not as a complex biological machine.
But this is also where technology can start being helpful, I think, and digital technology in particular, personal digital technology. A tremendous amount can be done now before a patient's seen to gather evidence about from a person-centered perspective, where actually the time you would have spent talking to the patient, listening to the patient, documenting that patient, actually the patient documents themselves and gives the information you need. And there are some improving ways of being able to capture all the things you would want to from a clinical assessment, or certainly from a holistic assessment, that at least gets you started and reduces the length of human time. The real issue here is about trying to reduce the human resource required to deliver person-centered care without losing we know the improved clinical outcomes from actually having a person-centered plan and organization of that care and support. So we're really in the middle, and I'm seeing it now from the work that we do, that we are beginning to see some real genuine I was very cynical about it, but we're seeing some real general improvements in our service. And we're just doing a pilot now where we have designed an artificial intelligence, using artificial intelligence to capture from a clinical interview between a nurse and a patient during their chemotherapy, whether or not, by having an AI listening in to the interview, and then it's called scraping. Do you know that? It's called scraping the data, and then allocate.
New one on me.
And then it allocates that into thematic analysis that we would want to put in place for person-centered care. And we're just starting a pilot, and we've already, and this is interesting, and I was so counterintuitive, we've already started to see that the AI tool has picked up things like the sentiment of the patient, things the patient's saying, their tone of voice, and realizing that if you compare the clinical documentation that has been documented by the nurse and the AI documentation, that the AI is picking up an awful lot more of the person-centered stuff than the nurse has. Now, you've got to be careful, because we all know that AI can lie, right? They can. Hallucinate. But we've got a lot of controls. This is only a pilot. It has been an eye-opener. And
we haven't talked about this. I'd love to see this, these data actually.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, and I think so. We've got to be creative as leaders and managers and stewards of resources to make sound investments in digital technology with a view to it supporting person-centered care, so that it becomes just a matter of the way in which a service is provided, not a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because you will pick it, and it'll be very interesting. We'll publish our outcomes, but it's been much more illuminating than I've ever thought it would be.
So it would seem that to develop PCC, you need to have reached a certain level of self-awareness, a certain degree of experience and knowledge as to what works and what does not, and what is missing. You need a starting point. So how do you, at the ESPCH, look to engender a starting point? And what role does education and leadership have in developing this starting point? Can we build on the confusion alone? Does anybody want to answer this one?
Well, I think I think it comes down to first of all, to ensuring that people have at least a basic understanding of the philosophy of person-centered care. I mean, volumes, libraries that have been written are full. Books have been written and libraries are full of people talking and ruminating at length and sometimes ad nauseum about the philosophy of person-centered care. And it's really time to sort of to get on with it. And I think that takes us back to something we were talking about earlier, or to what we were talking about earlier, which is building the evidence base. There's going on and droning on about the philosophy of person-centered care. We discuss it enough. We know the disagreements. We know the areas of overlap between different schools of thought and so on. We need to go further. We now need to generate more data, particularly hard quantitative, empirical data. I mean, this is essential, and this actually includes what Jonathan's just talked about the AI model he described in producing a lot of information that would otherwise be not captured and not lost, and of course working out what to do with that information collected by the AI system. I mean, does that information get referred to the multidisciplinary team? Does it get referred to the named clinician, et cetera, et cetera? All of this is concerned with implementation and so on. So we have to be data-driven, particularly empirical data-driven, if we're going to have a chance of making this work in terms of implementation. And we have to convince not only the clinicians, who can be cynical and skeptical and sometimes cynical, but also the CFOs that Jonathan mentioned a few moments ago. They're going to be convinced that it doesn't cost anything, or if it does, the returns are such as to justify that. And ideally, of course, they'll be looking for reduced costs. And there is empirical data already available which shows that the person-centered approaches can reduce costs by altering care processes. And I say so data-driven. We have to have this. What is the current the current jargon? We have to be laser focused on generating empirical data showing the clear benefits, clinical and economic, of this approach. I can't see any other way, likely statistically, probability of getting this into practice.
Do you have any other points to add to that?
No, I think that Andrew's completely correct in his assessment, but I think we are able to make a case for the engagement with this with this methodology, because if you're looking at the theory is well known, as Andrew's already said. We've got now studies and research. What we need in the field, which is where I'm based, is a very clear practical conceptual framework that you can then put into to hang the theory on, which is what we do. And there are a number of options available to make this actually become something which is captured even in the way in which our standing operating procedures work, the way in which we train staff to interact with patients, the way we capture clinical documentation in a way that then we can aggregate how. For example, if you had I don't know whether this happens, but we increasingly in the UK in social care, and particularly, people have their own budgets. They have a personalised budget. They have an allocation of money with the idea, which is a sound one, which is you might, as an individual, if you're responsible for what you buy in terms of care resources and things, with supervision, of course, to make sure you're safeguarding. We actually find that patients who have their own budgets make the right decisions first and then allocate the resources to support them in the things they really need, rather than take a big lump of resource that everybody gets because that's fair, and actually it's just money wasted. Whereas if they have their own personalized budget, they can buy in the support care they need, and that's the sort of thing we need to start looking at. But it is about putting this theory into operation, and also, it is also getting the experts to be the ones deciding on what the resources are, and those experts normally are the patients and the frontline clinicians.
The personalized budget, that was pioneered particularly in the care of people with advanced learning disabilities, I think, wasn't it?
It was, and also
there were a lot of success stories there.
Very, and people with disability. I remember, I think, to be honest, I remember at one of our conferences we had a patient who was describing how she had a muscle wasting disease, which actually caused her to develop chest infections because her respiratory function wasn't really. And she used to say that if it was just simple thing about, I need a stock of antibiotics in the house because I know when I'm going to start going off. Now, of course, everybody be fainting around hearing that anybody should be allowed to have an antibiotic in the house, but she would start her treatment before she ever got the pneumonia, which saved then a 10-day hospital stay. And with somebody who was, she had mobility issues, so she had a lot of equipment she needed. So to go into hospital, to be, losing all that extra muscle because you're not eating properly and all those things, she hadn't been in hospital for a year because she had control over what she needed. So there is a massively important financial reward for, but the problem is that there's an outlay, an investment needed upfront to be able to then release that. And in this day and age in our health service, that does not that cannot happen. They'd rather waste money. They'd rather waste money by not doing things properly, as to make it look better on one budget line than it does on another. And I'll just come back to the bottom line as well, because working in a commercial environment, you've got your top line, which is your service income, and then you've got your bottom line, which is your EBITDA, your profit. And the one thing that helps you either increase your profit by increasing the amount of money that you bring in, the service income, or you increase your profit by cutting costs. And in my life, I have never found a company that's cut its way to profit. You have to, but if you provide a high quality service, if you provide excellent clinical care, first of all, you won't spend as much because you're keeping people well, and you're not, but then people will come and buy your service, and therefore you increase your service income. So it's a win-win. It'll be interesting to see what the future holds for industry. But person-centered care is a path to profit. I can tell you that.
Well, thank you, Professor Andrew Miles and Professor Sir Jonathan Asbridge, for all your comments and discussions. And I would like to make one last point before we come to the end of our podcast and video. We believe that person-centeredness and person-centered care is part of a continuum. We all interact with differing scope and opportunity at different points of the continuum, and all individuals on all sides are unique. But once we are aware of the continuum and the scope of our interactions as determined often by our environment itself, understanding how person-centeredness evolves depending on whether you are a clinician with limited interaction, a family doctor with ongoing interaction, a nurse or personal support worker in the home, or social workers in their various domains, would better help an understanding of what care should look like throughout. We need a better view of the person and the wider system, and factors that impact the person and how we can improve. We also need to acknowledge that we lack the resources to do everything, that we must collaborate and work together and focus on what this wider definition of person-centeredness and its system can bring to the table. That is a very large part of what we aim to do here at Mosaic, or at least try. I would also like to mention the actioning group of PCC here in Ontario, Canada, through Trillium Health Partners in their work on person-centered care. The actioning group consists of healthcare professionals, researchers, community agencies, government agencies. Some of the areas we are working on as an actioning group for the future are to build relationships within national and international networks, encourage a holistic approach for PCC, build capacity for actioning PCC within and across organizations, and identify best practices to highlight evidence of the impact of PCC are just a few areas that I've highlighted. There has been an awful lot to discuss on this podcast today on the PCC movement. One last and final question, and can you also elaborate on the ESPCH 7 conference being held in London, UK in 2026, and also how individuals can contact you for more information?
Yep, absolutely. We are planning for, there's been so much going on in the society that we really getting the seventh annual conference and award ceremony of the society up and running has been a bit on the back burner because there's been so much else with building partnerships with clinical institutions and academic institutions here, and book contracts which should result in a plethora of publications next year and so on. But we are working towards mid to late April of next year. So that's probably around about the second or third week after Easter, which next year, Easter Sunday next year, falls on, I think I'm correct in saying, the 5th of April. So mid to end April, almost certainly in London. And as soon as that's confirmed, which it should be within the next 2 weeks or so, we will publish that and circulate the details and so on.
And how would somebody get a hold of you to find out more information?
Well, we normally send details to everybody who are members and fellows and so on of the society. We'll publish in various journals. We'll do a lot of direct marketing, direct notification, so to speak, of all of the people on our various databases that we have, and we'll be distributing full details to all people in our networks and asking those in our networks to distribute it to their own. And of course, we would be asking Mosaic to do the same.
Fine. I also, thank you for that. I also wanted to highlight some of the other organizations that I forgot to add that I feel are doing an amazing work here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. One is Shepherd Village Retirement and Long-Term Care Home, North York General Hospital, Behavioral Supports Ontario. They're doing a lot on person-centered language and person-centered healthcare as well. Canadian Institute Social Prescribing and Alliance for Healthier Communities as well. Also, the Alzheimer's Society Toronto. So there are many, I think, wonderful organizations that are doing some very unique things and trying to implement person-centered care within their models, framework, and organizations.
Oh no, absolutely, absolutely. And what we can do at the society, and as we have been doing over the 12 years, is trying to bring as many of those organizations together to talk together, because what we've seen is over the last 12 years of the life of the society and before, is that people, this is quite typical for academics, really. You know, you will have a group of people looking at narrative in one part of the world, somebody else looking at cultural context, somebody else looking at preferences, somebody else looking at values, and it's really about getting, you know, in a coordinated way and a coordinating way to bring these people into dialogue and interaction. And the organization you just mentioned that's doing some work in person-centered language, I'd be interested to be put in touch if they're interested with them, because one thing the Society has been working on for the last 2 years is a pretty extensive A to Z lexicon, dictionary, if you like, of person-centered terms.
All right.
A for accompaniment, you know, C for cultural context, N for narrative. So we've got a big publication coming together, which looks at language under A, B, C, and so on. So it might be useful to talk to those colleagues you mentioned about that too.
So I can try and, yes, find out from Behavioral Supports Ontario who you might be able to contact for that. Do you have any other comments to add before we end this podcast? I've been looking at the time as you've been talking, just so we're staying on time for Jonathan to leave. Any other points you quickly wanted to add?
I'm fine. We can't ignore AI anymore, and I think Jonathan gave a very pertinent example of that. And so I think that person-centered care has to embrace AI, and while there may be downsides of things which have always worried me, with things like telemedicine and video interviews and so on, there's the potential for so many diagnostic and other cues to be lost when there isn't a proper face-to-face across the table or in the next chair clinic, traditional clinic approach. There is also an upside, and Jonathan's example is very interesting there as an upside of AI. I think AI will destroy a lot of things in our society as well as create. And of course, the first rule of medicine in particular has been, you know, to balance risks and benefits. And I think when it comes to AI generally and AI in person-centered care, we're going to have to keep an eye on the benefits versus the disadvantages, just as we would when considering a particular therapy or drug.
Anything you'd like to add, Jonathan?
No, not at all. I think it's always useful, and it's enjoyable to talk about about what we love.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
it all goes back to our love of our patients and the fact that's why we're here. We haven't. You don't go into healthcare necessarily to be rich, but you do go into it to support and help people, and to see improvements in the world.
That's right. Yeah, thank you. And yes, I think we're all passionate about this topic, certainly. And thank you again, Professor Andrew Miles and Professor Jonathan Asbridge, for being our guests and providing us with your insight on PCC always. It's not every day that I can speak with individuals such as yourselves on this topic, who have so much knowledge, experience, and passion, most definitely. Thank you, listeners, for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. To view the article, Person-Centered Care 2025, it's high time that we nudge the rhetoric into reality. Please download our Mosaic Home Care and Community Resource Fall newsletter at www.mosaichomecare.com. And this is Jane Teasdale signing off from Mosaic Home Care. Stay tuned for our next podcast. Thank you so much.